wilderness tabernacle would have looked like. There is actually a good deal on the internet now you can find that really good, pretty accurate models. I can give you a couple links for like YouTube. There's actually a fantastic YouTube channel. I think it's run by a Mormon guy who does really wonderful graphic art. And as far as I can tell, and I don't have any particular expertise on this field, but it sure does conform accurately to the details of the text, of the biblical text that I can come across in scholarship and stuff. It's really cool. But anyways, you could Google all sorts of tabernacle imagery, and it's well worth going through each, the inner court and the inner sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, the Ark. We'll talk about most of that. We won't talk about any of it in too much particular detail, but it's really fun to do that if you ever want to. I can point you to some resources that will help you with that. Also, as we go through the 4 weeks here, the resources that I use, I will try to mention some of the more important ones, at least important to me in my study of this and my learning process of this content. As we go, I'll mention names and sources, but I don't have it all cited in the slideshow or in the handout, and I won't go through, like on Sundays, a lot of times the pastors will have long quotes and sources cited. But I'm just it's all up here, and I'm just gonna spit it out, and if I remember, I will credit the person who taught me that, and then you can look them up. I will tell you that the main resource that I have come to love the most on particularly the tabernacle, and it's what we'll talk about here starting tonight, it's symbolism. It's narrative, literary meaning within the flow of Scripture, particularly the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, is by a scholar named Michael Morales. It's called Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? It's fantastic. It's not overly academic. He's a scholar. It's an academic work. It's in the New Studies in Biblical Theology series. But the writing style, I don't think is too much for almost any, fairly capable, literate Christian reader. It's really pretty accessible. You don't need to know Hebrew or have any real facility with it. He's done a great job of really condensing this all into a really rigorously researched work, but it's still really, I think, pretty easy to read. If you want to get a hold of one thing and you wonder where the heck is he coming from, it's Morales' book, and it's just been invaluable. There's a lot of other stuff I've combed through and read in some depth, some detail or other, but that's the one for the broadest recommendation that I would probably point you to.
It's called what? Who Shall Ascend?
Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? Yeah, I think that's right. It's Michael Morales. It's in the New Studies in Biblical Theology series. They have a commentary series on topics like this, and really well done. Anyway, I can send you links and stuff later. Just come and remind me. Other than that, I will mention other scholars and such as we go. But let's get into the actual content here, and I'm going to break one of my own rules to start this thing, which is I have somewhat of an obsession with bringing the biblical story from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, forward into the New Testament, so that when we get to the New Testament, we can understand where all this stuff came from. What was the context? What was the story being told that now we ended up in the Gospels or in the New Testament epistles? I think the church is pretty bad at that. I think we like to start with the answers because we have Jesus and we have the New Testament, and then we just say, that's the stuff that gave us this, thank you, but really here's where we're going to put our attention. I think that's a huge mistake, and I have sort of a personal vendetta mission to make as much as possible Christians familiar with the scriptures that gave them their scriptures, right? The Old Testament that produces the New, that gives all the narrative and theological and sort of in every other way the support and the source of the content that we have. Anyway, I'm going to break that rule, and I'm going to start with the book of Hebrews, which is this really phenomenal, really sophisticated work doing a commentary on, largely, the tabernacle and the tabernacle system under the Mosaic covenant in the wilderness. It's doing more than that, but that is, at its heart, is this idea of comparing the covenant with Moses to the new covenant, which Jesus enacts and inaugurates. But one of the anchors for the author of Hebrews is, in fact, the tabernacle comparison. What Jesus has done, he has done in completion of what the tabernacle was always pointing to in the first place. And so that's some of what we're going to point out. But look at the language that Hebrews uses, and this will help orient you to how I'm going to go through the teaching on the tabernacle. So there's some of this in chapter 8 as well, but here we are in Hebrews 9, in verse 9, and then look with me at verse 11. So in Hebrews, in 9:9, the author says that he's introduced the tent, right, the tabernacle in the wilderness. And it's interesting in Hebrews, he doesn't mention the temple, right? He's writing, presumably during the temple still standing. Some people think it's after the temple had already been destroyed. I think it's probably before the temple was destroyed. And he knows it's going to be destroyed soon, because Jesus said it would, right? And so he's clearly referencing the temple of Jerusalem in the first century, sometime, I think, before its fall, before its destruction by the Romans. But he doesn't ever mention it. When he refers to the house of God, his reference point is always the tabernacle. Now, this is a deeper point about Hebrews, which we won't have time to get into, but I just think that's interesting, and I suspect, my theory on this is because, and something we'll come probably loop back to, and I will mention again as we go through the tabernacle series. I suspect part of the problem of his day that he's trying to address with these mostly Jewish believers is the problem that Jeremiah had, which was when you have a temple, stone, stable, stationary temple, the tendency becomes to trust that this is impenetrable. This is God's house. We are in God's city. We are on his holy mountain, as we'll talk about in a moment. And it's sanctified, and nothing can go wrong here, right? It's the eternal city. This is the house of God. What could possibly happen? In Jeremiah's day, that's exactly the message that he preaches against, right? Or his message is exactly against that type of thinking. They thought they had the temple of the Lord, and nothing could defeat them, right? It was almost like a magical, superstitious belief. And I suspect the author of Hebrews has something similar in mind, because something similar is happening. And so what he wants to point them to is, no. Remember, the original version was this movable, portable tent that was also the house of God. The temple was built off of the tabernacle. It was never the point that you need God to end up in a place that he could then protect you from. Does that make sense? You with me? I think one of the deeper messages of Hebrews is that believers should be prepared for the day when they won't have the stability of the political order that they think they do, and they better be ready to get on the move, so to speak, right? And I just think that's a brilliant little riff. Anyway, he's getting into all this in chapter 9, and when he's talking about the tent that was in the wilderness, that all of these things were it says in the translation something like this: they were symbolic for the present age, or the age then present, we're not sure. But it's actually the Greek word for parable, right? These were parabolic. These were not just the tent, not just the tabernacle, but the whole system. All the objects, the furniture, everything in the system of the tabernacle was a parable. Think about that for a minute. It's remarkable. And then he goes on to say, but, and he's contrasting here, of course, when Messiah appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. So we'll get into that more. But you have the basic starting point here of there is some model, as read on in Hebrews, you get to verse 23 and 24, makes clear there's some model that this tabernacle in the wilderness was based on. And he calls, again, that whole system, these things, copies, in verse 23. Copies of the heavenly things, or types. This was a type of something else. So the process of ritually purifying the temple, the tabernacle, and all of its stuff, and priests, let's say, and I'll talk about that more in a week or two, that whole process was indicating, it was a model of something, it was based on something, some deeper reality. So this is the point. We get into some of the, when he says they are copies of the true things, we tend to think of heavenly visions, let's say that Ezekiel will see. Ezekiel will see this magnificent vision of a temple. It's a temple at the end of Ezekiel. And we tend to think of visions like that, or say the book of Revelation, which we'll come to by the end of this a little bit, which takes place almost entirely in the heavenly temple courtroom. That's what the whole thing's going on there, is a liturgical service within the temple. We tend to think of that as like, oh, those are the spiritual realities, and these were the physical ones. And something just in our sort of modern Western thinking then kind of orients us to understand that as the physical stuff was real, right? You could touch it and taste it and see it. And the physical and the spiritual stuff is, I mean, we believe in it, but it's not really real. And this flips that exactly on its head. The real substance of what the tabernacle was actually the shadow. It was actually the thing based on something more real, something real. And that's the heavenly. So spiritual and physical turns out not to be a very good way to understand any of this, right? It turns out it's more about the heavenly reality, which is the eternal one, and then the way that gets replicated in a smaller, tangible, visible, encounterable version for humans. But that's we could build a whole thought session on this, but I just want to start there. When we start getting into this, you'll see a lot of it is, I'm going to ask you to think conceptually a little bit outside of the way we probably typically learn, well, what is ritual about? And what were these sacrifices doing? And why would God arrange it this way? And I'm going to suggest just to start thinking more in terms of, because there's a cosmic, supernatural realm, and it's not the place that is so unlike ours that we just kind of hope we get there one day, and otherwise we're kind of afraid of it. It is actually the thing, it's actually the reality that our reality is based on. We are the thin version of God's reality, right? And so the tabernacle kind of follows that paradigm. And I'm going to lean really heavily into that stuff, and I just want to put you on notice now. I didn't make it up. This is what the author of Hebrews is doing when he's talking about, what's happening here. All right, so moving forward here. To Exodus, which is where the tabernacle is introduced to us. I'm by the way, skipping over in the narrative flow of the Torah, of the book from Genesis, several encounters with God's representatives that happen, that live out a, say, temple or tabernacle-like reality. Abraham is one. Noah before him is one. Noah's flood and the ark is pitched. The story is told as if the ark is a temple of a sort, and Noah is the priest in the temple. Like, there are deep narrative structures running through all these stories. Narrative, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Jacob's ladder. Not a ladder. It's a stairway. It's something like, we'll talk about the story of Babel. They're trying to build something. I think that was a temple structure. The idea is to bring the gods down, or in Jacob's case, he has an experience that's a temple-like place that he experiences. He sees the beyond the veil, if you will. He sees the heavenly reality sort of infiltrating the earthly one, and he's like, oh, this is the house of God, right? What does he name it? Bethel. This is the house of God. How did he get that idea? Because these are all little temple excursions, if you will. But that's, like I said, we didn't have time for it, and then I named 4. Exodus is where we actually get this tabernacle that would be Israel's meeting place with God. So Exodus 25, and this is a handy verse to keep in the back of your mind, just make a note of it. Verse 8, let them make me a sanctuary, holy place, that I may dwell in their midst. And, getting back to the book of Hebrews, make it exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so shall you make it. That word for pattern there is what Hebrews is picking up on, using as a copy, like a scale replica. It's like a mini version of something that already, again, exists. We're not sure totally here if Moses is getting this pattern, like, does he see it in a vision? That's kind of my default understanding, is God must have given him some vision. But also then the instructions that will follow from Exodus 25, I think, to 35, are instructions for building the tabernacle. So that's also instruction for how to build it. So that could be the pattern too, or I suspect it might be both. But in any case, again, verse 40, see that you make them after the pattern for them, which is being shown to you on the mountain. So Moses is up on the mountain. We'll get to this in a minute. But you see the idea. There's some, it's like architectural plans, I guess, or something, right? Only cosmic architectural plans, like a set of blueprints. There's some mystery to how this exactly worked. And then David will do something similar when he wants to build the temple. He won't build the temple. His son Solomon will. But David will give Solomon the instructions. Like, yeah, God showed me. He didn't let me do it, but he showed me the sort of model that we're basing it on. Okay. This whole idea is actually very common and very culturally easily identified in the ancient world. Ancient cultures, especially around Israel, their neighbors, just had a basic default understanding that if you're building a temple, it is to house a deity, right? Gods lived in temples. Actually, they lived on high places in the conceptual thinking, like in the cognitive processes of ancient people. But they didn't do much good up there unless you gave them a house in your town, in your city or whatever, to dwell among you. This would be, say, a common Mesopotamian view, or even Egyptians had views like this. And so the thing to do is build them a house, put the image, an idol statue, carved, properly cared for, put that in the temple, in the sanctuary, the holy deepest shrine area of your house you build for your deities. And then there were actually these ritual processes they'd go through it's called washing the mouth. It's like a purification process. Literally sort of, not woke them up, but like made them brought the gods to live in the idol. We might get to more of this, I'm just running through quickly. And then when that deity inhabited that idol, that image, it was thought, and not like imagined, they actually sort of thought that the god now dwells in this place. And there they are. That's a common view in the ancient world throughout a lot of the ancient world, but certainly around Israel's neighbors. So the idea then was that ancient temple building ceremonies, inaugural like dedications of temples, were modeled after creation accounts. You get this in Ugaritic literature and Akkadian and like Mesopotamian stuff if you read through it. It's not that I'm suggesting you do that. It's fun, it's bizarre, but it matches, a lot of it matches the Bible's sort of presentation of ideas, at least in the form. They take a similar form. And I'm going to argue in a few moments that they sometimes mean very different things. They will vary radically through what they're actually teaching. But it would look similar. One of the main things that happens here is that temple dedication ceremonies, which by the way usually lasted, or very often were 7 days, right? They were appointed to be 7 days, were based on creation. And that seems to be what's going on from the very beginning of Genesis with the creation account. So you got the slideshow up here if you can see it, and again I can make this available to anyone. In Genesis 1:2 you have the sort of problem stated, right? That the earth was without form and void. Those two Hebrew words have the meaning of having no structure, not properly ordered, and not inhabited, right? Empty of inhabitants. So the way Genesis works out, and this is not a Genesis study, or I would have a lot more to say about this, but you can see the basic sort of literary structure here. Day 1 is God forming the unformed night from day. So creating and distinguishing day from night is an act of forming boundaries, right? It's an act of ordering things into a coherent and inhabitable ordered realm. That is matched with day 4, which then puts inhabitants in the place he just ordered, which are the heavenly bodies, the light, right? Let there be lights in the heavens. And we'll come back to that word. These are the sun, moon, and stars in the narrative story, but they're divine beings in the mind of most ancient thinkers, right? Like the stuff that's the twinkling balls of light up there are actually thought, again, to be deities of some sort, divine beings of some description. So this is all patterned after a process of arranging stuff, putting things in order, creating realms that can function the way they're supposed to, and then appointing, let's say, functionaries or people or things to do what they're supposed to do in that realm. So you give it structure, order, which allows it to function, and then you put people in there to function, right? It's not always people, sometimes it's fish or birds, right? But the basic idea here you can see, and it ends up in a culminating day of Shabbat, of rest, the day of Sabbath, which is not exactly the idea that, well, now there's nothing left to do, let's just hang out. It is more the idea, and I get this primarily from a scholar named John Walton, whose stuff I very much recommend if you want to get into Genesis. It has overlap with the Tabernacle, but I'm just going to mention him in passing. He's got a lot of good stuff, like the Lost World, his Lost World series is really good. But I owe most of my understanding of Genesis, the creation account here, to John Walton. But his point on the Sabbath, it's not the day when everything's done so you can stop activity. As much as, I mean, it involves that. But it is the day when, if, as he sees it, what you have here is a temple building ceremony, right? When God is creating the heavens and the earth, he is building a house for himself to inhabit, right? He wants to dwell there. This is the idea we're going to come to in the Tabernacle. So how does he do that? Well, first you've got to set it up. You've got to erect, you've got to put things where they go, right? Order it, structure it. It's just a mass of stuff laying there. You've got to structure it and arrange it. Then you need inhabitants in there to work it, right? So you can think about this as forming and then filling. That's kind of the pattern. When you get to the Sabbath, the goal there, or let's say the idea there, is not you've reached your goal, let's just relax. The idea is, okay, this was the whole point, was to get us to Shabbat, to get us to this day, which now allows the king or the god, and sometimes they're just merged, right? The king represents the gods in ancient thinking. He can take up his rule from this place. That security, that equilibrium that's been established, where you can now rule over the kingdom, that's what Sabbath is for. It's for kingdom operations, not for relaxing. It overlaps, right? It merges. There is relaxation on Sabbath. I don't want to be misunderstood here. God knows I need relaxation on my Sabbaths. That is what I use it for. But it's not meant to be purely leisure. It's meant to be something deeper the idea of work, as we'll come to, is not there are two kinds of work in Hebrew, two words for it. One is the work that's completed that you don't do on Shabbat. But the other one is priestly service, the word we use for priestly service, which we'll come to. But anyway, the whole idea here is very much that once the temple is properly constructed and staffed, right, with whoever's supposed to work it in there, it becomes, once the deity takes up residence in the temple, it becomes the operational